Hello, and thanks for joining me in this discussion of surface weather observations and reports. We are going to start by looking at the background behind surface weather observations. In other words, where do they come from, how do they get started, and what purpose do they serve? After that, we'll talk about the different types of observations and then the types of reports. So first, the background. The first thing I'd like to discuss is where surface weather observations came from. Back in the 1920s, the late 1920s, aviation was very dangerous. Aircraft were crashing, and weather was a huge factor in that. The Guggenheim Foundation had a large sum of money, and they funded a study and set up a committee called the Committee on Aeronautical Meteorology. And what that committee did was they funded the development of an aviation weather network. Western Air Express set up an airline from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And they wanted to make sure that that airline was safe. So they also set up a weather network that was funded by the Guggenheim Foundation. And what they did was they made weather observations and then also transmitted that weather information to reporting stations along the coast down along California from San Francisco all the way down to LA. And that system pretty much stayed in effect. It spread across the United States. The Weather Bureau took it over, and they were in charge of aviation weather across the United States. The code that they used later on after the war was called the SAO, or the Surface Aviation Code. And this was, of course, a code to allow weather information to be transmitted very quickly. Remember, back then there wasn't much bandwidth, and we transferred information via teletype. So the code had to be very, very tidy. After a while, the international community developed another code called the METAR code. This was used in much of the world except the United States and surrounding countries. It was introduced in 1968, and it became the ICAO standard, the International Civil Aviation Organization, for weather information around the world. The United States decided to change from the SA code to the METAR code in 1996. Of course, the National Weather Service was the organization that was set up to handle weather information, and they had to set standards for making weather observations. The standard book for surface weather aviation observations is called Federal Meteorological Handbook Number 1, or shorthand for FMH Number 1. And they set the standards for weather observing, also for coding METARs, and then also reporting weather phenomena. The FAA also has a hand in weather information. Of course, most weather information is used at airports. So the FAA set up their own, and it was taken over by the FAA, the Weather Bureau's weather observing at airports, in 2014. And the FAA has their own book, which is called Joint Order JO 7900.5E. And what that does, it lays out the methods and standards for surface weather observations at airports. And this also is a method for which weather observers are certificated. In other words, human weather observers have to read this book, memorize it, and then take a test to be able to make weather observations themselves. So we're going to talk about the different types of weather observations now. First off, there are manual observations, then there are automated, and then finally augmented observations. Manual observations are ones that are made by a human weather observer, meaning the entire observation is made by a human weather observer, meaning that there is not a weather machine at the airport, and a human actually goes out and makes all the observations, including pressure, temperature, sky condition, visibility, and other things, wind also for that matter. The problem with this type of observation is that it's expensive. Humans have to be paid, and they don't like working at night, so they get paid extra for that. So they tend to be very expensive. And also they're subjective, meaning that One person may see visibility of 15 miles, another person may only say that that visibility is 9 miles. So it depends upon, of course, the weather observer. Manual weather observations are not really common anymore. They're very rare. Most locations have weather machines or a combination of weather machines and humans. So automated observations are observations that are made, of course, from meteorological instruments, what we call sensors that are observing the weather. And those sensors, of course, are digital information that gets sent to a computer. The computer goes through algorithms to average it and does quality assurance, and it puts out the report. So a totally automated observation is one where no human beings are involved, and the entire observation was made by a weather system or a weather machine. A third type of weather observation is an augmented observation. This is where you take the best things of an automated system and also of a manual system and combine them. So an augmented observation is one where the machine produces parts of the observation, but the human weather observer can look at the observation and make their own changes, and perhaps maybe even add additional information if needed. You know that a observation was augmented when you look at a METAR and notice there is no auto that is reported in the METAR. When you see the contraction auto, that means the entire observation was made by a machine. When auto is taken out, that means that there is a human being at the airport that is providing additional information and also backup for the weather machine. As mentioned earlier, human weather observers need to be certified. They need to read a book, take a test, and then with that, they have a certificate on file which says they can make weather observations and they can make METARs. So the test, of course, is based on the FAA Joint Order 7900.5E. And so for weather observers to be able to make weather observations, they have to be current also. And currency means they have to make 5 weather observations per month to be able to hold their currency. The FAA has set up a method by which weather observations can be augmented. If there is a weather machine at the airport, then they have a method by which humans can actually augment those observations. And this program is called the Limited Aviation Weather Reporting Station Program. And what it states is that where there is a weather machine, the air traffic controllers in the tower can make weather observations and they can augment the weather observations that are being put out by the weather machine. However, at some locations, the air traffic is very busy, and as a result, controllers really don't have much time to observe the weather. So as a result, there is contract weather observers. This is where the FAA hires a company to provide weather observations at busy airports. And you can just imagine the airports where they have contract weather observers, places like Chicago O'Hare, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dallas, JFK, large airports where the controllers don't have much time to make weather observations. Typically, there is a contract weather office there. The FAA also defines the service standards for augmentation at these airports that have weather observers. And these service standards depend upon the amount of air traffic at the airport and also depend upon the severity of the weather, how bad the weather is at those particular airports. The FAA has a scorecard, so if an airport has really bad weather and lots of air traffic, they get a letter A, service standard A, which means that the weather observer there can provide the highest level of augmentation. Whereas if the airport really doesn't have much going on, there may not even be a control tower, then that weather machine will have a service standard D, where that means there is no augmentation. And then B and C are levels in between A and B, with B being higher, of course, than C. So what that means is at level A, they can provide a lot of information, and at level C, that's the first level of augmentation, and there is just a little bit of backup and augmentation there. And then level D, there is nothing at all, just the automated weather machine doing its thing. So what is meant by augmentation and backup? Human weather observers at the airport, if an airport has augmented weather observations, humans can back up the weather machine, meaning that the weather machine will produce the observation, but the human looks at the observation and determines if some of the systems or some of the sensors are broken. If the sensors are definitely broken, then they can actually make their own observation and put that information in. So that's what backup means. Augmentation means that the weather observers are able to provide additional information beyond what the weather machine is saying. For example, they can report modest clouds, or they can report visibilities down to zero, which machines cannot do. So this is additional information that can be provided in the METAR, which gives you a lot of information about what's going on at the airport. Finally, the different types of reports. There are two different types of surface aviation observations. The first one is a routine report, which of course we call a METAR. But then, if there is special weather criteria that has been met, then a special observation will be reported. In the other videos that I've produced, I go into depth as far as special observations and the criteria for special. And I also talk about METAR observations and generally the main body of the METAR, as well as remarks. So you can watch my other videos to get more information about METARs and species. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and please come back and watch my other videos.